can you seal dirty down paints on a model without completely trashing it? If you go looking online, you'll find all sorts of ideas and suggestions ranging from no, you cannot seal this stuff at all, you can't varnish it, all the way through to yes, use this one product and you'll have no problems whatsoever. Which is interesting. So I decided to test it. So I've taken 4 different options. Some of them have been recommended by you, some of them I found as suggestions online, and some I wanted to test for myself. And the results? They were not what I was expecting. Now what I initially wanted to do was to make something that was completely comparable. So I tried to make some test pieces using some grease-proof paper and then priming that in AK Interactive's grey primer. Then 2 coats of paint over top of that and then putting a range of Dirty Down products over that so I could try and get it as comparable as I could. Nice idea, but as the paper then kind of curled up, it flexed the paint and then basically peeled it off. So that didn't work and back to the drawing board. Now going into my bits box, because I had a few bits of this terrain kind of kicking about. So I'd already primed these in the AK Interactive grey microfiller and primer, and then painted that in Vallejo black brown, and then we've got some test pieces we can then use. And now that's dry, I'm then going to use the water-soluble Dirty Down Rust effect. Now one thing I found with these Dirty Down products is that we know that temperature affects it. So if it's not warm enough, then it won't develop at all. But what I have found, and I'll be interested to find out if you have the same experience, is that once the air temperature gets to about 30 degrees Celsius, then it also loses its ability to develop. And bear in mind the air temperature when I recorded this was pretty much bang on 30 degrees, then yeah, it wasn't enjoying it very much. It was very thick and all you got was a very dark, brown, slightly furry kind of result. So whilst I've not tested this significantly, what I have found so far is that you can dilute it a little bit with a little bit of Vallejo airbrush thinner, and that thins it down enough, especially when it's hot, to allow it to have a better chance of developing without completely blowing it out. But we'll come back to that in a bit. Now also to make the colours a little bit brighter, add a bit more colour variation in there, make it a bit easier to see on screen as well, I'm going to use dab on a little bit of that Dirty Down yellow rust as well, just in places, and just to enhance and bring that colour up a little bit. Okay, so now they're all dry, I've now got 4 basically identical pieces, well they've been treated the same anyway. So to ensure we can keep track of what we've done to what particular test piece, I'm going to use a little bit of this masking tape and then use that to write on so I can remember what I've done to each individual piece. Now for these I'm going to test them in a number of different ways. Now the first variable that I wanted to take out of the equation is if it is dry or not. So I've applied all the Dirty Down stuff and I've let it dry for the best part of a week. So therefore the product not having time to cure is not part of the equation. So that we're not looking at today. So the first thing I'm going to test today is the distance you're spraying from. So if you are up close or further away, then what difference does that make? Okay, so I've got 4 different types of varnish. I've got 2 spray cans and I've got 2 that I'm going to put through an airbrush. I'm also going to try and apply those by brush as well. Now as always, this video is not sponsored and I've bought these 4 products to test. Now after testing these, if one of them gives you the result that you're looking for you and your project, and you want to try and get hold of some for yourself or even check out how much it costs, then I've put some links down in the description for you. You will also find them on my website, flyingravenstudios.com. Now the first one I'm going to test out is this one from Rust-Oleum. Now this is Rust-Oleum Crystal Clear, and this one has actually been recommended in various places on the internet. Now assuming I picked up the product that the original poster meant, but as far as I'm aware, this is what was recommended. So that's the first one we're going to test. Now the second rattle can I want to test is the enamel humbrel. Now this stuff we have tested before, but there's some different variables that I want to play with. The first one I want to try out is the Rust-Oleum Crystal Clear, and I'm going to do it at arm's length, so using the breeze from behind me to try and help carry that varnish onto the model. Now this took a little bit of practice and a little bit of test and adjust, Because sometimes you press the trigger and it goes nowhere near the model. But after a little bit, then yes, I managed to get a gentle mist going across the model. And then with a separate piece, I did it a lot closer, so about 30 centimeters or so. Now this is the satin varnish from Vallejo. Now this is the first of the varnishes that I wanted to test through an airbrush. It's also one of the ones I'm going to try and apply with a brush. Now I've seen this stuff recommended online, but that was the matte version. I don't have the matte version, but I do have the satin. So I want to test this, A, to see how the satin works over the Dirty Down paint, but also see if the general formula works as a varnish for it as well. Now this is the second brush applied varnish I'm going to test out today. Now this is Talens. Now this matte acrylic varnish was recommended by one of you guys, and Talens is a very well established fine art brand. It's predominantly used with a brush over acrylic and oil colour paintings. But I'm told it works well in this, so that'll be a really interesting test. So first of all, I'm going to try the Vallejo satin varnish. I'm going to apply this neat with a brush. And then after cleaning the brush out completely, make sure it's dry, and then do the same thing again, neat with the Talens. So next I want to try these two through an airbrush. Now with any airbrushing, especially with this sort of stuff, you should make sure you've got plenty of ventilation, and also using a P3 mask. Now because this stuff is slightly thicker, I'm going to crank up the pressure slightly to help it go through the airbrush. I was not expecting this. Now putting the Talens straight through the airbrush is coming out almost in very, very fine filament wire. It looks like spider webs all over the project, which is a very, very cool effect if I intended to do that, but I didn't. But if I wanted to create a spider web effect on a model, then this could be quite a cool way of doing it, but yeah, it's not quite what I'm looking for. So what I'll try instead is by thinning it down a little bit. Now being entirely honest with you, and also the first time I've used this stuff, I'm not entirely sure of the best product to use to thin this. So therefore I'm going to try some of the Vallejo airbrush thinner with the Talens and mix it up and see how that works. Now it has thinned down quite nicely, and it's now running through the airbrush a lot better. So I then repeated this procedure with the Vallejo satin. Once again, thinned it down ever so slightly to make it fair and to help it flow through the airbrush, and then airbrush that. And as a final test with the Talens, because it had struggled a little bit going through the airbrush and doing it at higher pressure, I decided to thin it and then put it through a low pressure but at a fairly close distance and see what effect that had. So therefore we've now looked at how close you spray to it, whether it be a rattle can or an airbrush. Also how it's affected by if you paint it on with a paintbrush by hand. We've also now looked at higher versus low pressure through an airbrush as well. So how did they come out? Okay, first of all, let's look at this Humbrol. Now this is the rattle can, which did it from an arm's length. As you can see there, it's still very matte and it hasn't really affected the patina too much as well. It's dulled it down a little bit maybe, but nothing crazy at all. You've still got quite a nice effect there. However, if I flip it over and look at when I sprayed it close, then yes, you can see versus the control, it has knocked a lot of that effect out completely. It's still there a little bit, you've got a little bit of patina there, but it has dulled it down a lot. So comparing the Humbrol close to the Rust-Oleum close. Now, both sides you've kind of lost a lot of the patina, but you got a little bit more with the Humbrol. But interestingly, bear in mind the Rust-Oleum is meant to be a matte spray. It's quite a satin finish to it. It's not really glossy, but it's a lot more satin compared to the Humbrol, and that's rather interesting. Now if I move this away onto the control side, look at the control on the right hand side compared to the Rust-Oleum at 3 coats at a distance, at arm's length, you really can see how kind of quite shiny it is. Also very surprising, bear in mind this is the one that I've seen most recommended online to be the best thing to varnish over Dirty Down. Okay, so looking onto the Vallejo. Now, this one, first of all, is the brush. Now, we started off with quite a strong colour patina on the right-hand side, as you can see. On the left-hand side, it hasn't dropped it down that much at all. I'm quite pleasantly surprised. You can see down the centre it's a bit darker. I think that's where maybe the brush stroke was a bit stronger. I laid it on a bit thicker, maybe. I'm not entirely sure. I didn't try to do that way. But there's a definite darker pattern down the middle, which I actually quite like. Okay, so comparing the two, so the Vallejo and the Talons from a distance, what we can see is that it has dulled down on both sides a bit of the patina. You've still got it on both sides. You've still got that rusty effect coming through, which is great to see. It hasn't killed those out. However, the Talons appears to be a lot glossier on the right hand side. You can see there compared to the Vallejo. Bear in mind the Talons is meant to be matte, and the Vallejo is meant to be satin. The Talons appears to be a lot glossier, a lot shinier than the Vallejo. However, if we then compare the normal pressure compared to a low pressure, then it's a lot more matte on the Talons on the low pressure. So doing it with diluted with multiple coats with a low pressure, that works out very nicely. You've still maintained that patina, but you've also got a much more matte finish as well. Now looking at these, I think these are my three favourites so far. So the Vallejo is slightly more satin, but you'd expect that because it's a satin varnish. But you have still maintained that patina. The Talons, slightly diluted on a low pressure through an airbrush, it's kind of maintained that patina, but has a nice matte finish as well. And finally, with the Humbrol, I must admit I'm really surprised. When we tested this before, I did it about 30-40 centimetres away, but it was good, but it still knocked down the colour a lot. Using the Humbrol at arm's distance has made a massive difference. It's a really nice matte result. You've still got a nice patina coming through. Okay, so one of the reasons people like to varnish these models in the first place, especially with the Dirty Down, is to seal it. So therefore, if you want to put another effect over the top of that, or you don't want to damage it by moisture or it getting damp. So okay, so first of all, let's test to see how waterproof these techniques have actually been. So to test this, I'm going to get a piece of kitchen roll, dampen it with some clean water, and just dab that over all the test pieces and let them dry. Okay, so once that's dried, you've got a little bit of bloom, a little bit of yellowing coming through on the Talons, which is interesting. On the Vallejo, there's nothing really there. And there's a tiny little bit of bloom coming through on the Humbrol. But once again, nothing too crazy. It still looks good. Now, one challenge of applying these varnishes this way is that because you're doing very, very light coats and it's almost dry before it hits the model, it's really difficult to see where you've been and where it's been missed. So despite that, you've got quite a good result with these three. Okay, so let's really up the ante a little bit. Let's see what happens if we put some AK Interactive still water on these. Will it knock out the patina, or will it make it bloom and go like white, or will it do something weird? Let's find out. So applying a little bit of the AK Interactive still water and letting it dry. On all three, you've still got the patina kind of showing through. It hasn't gone like a dark brown, which is really, really good. And likewise, it hasn't done anything crazy or too weird. Hasn't reacted in a way that you might not expect. So all four products will seal them enough to allow them to have fairly waterproof, but also to allow you to put additional effects over the top of them without any undue results. Now looking at the Talons, which we applied with a brush, it's gotten a lot darker, but it looks a lot wetter as well. Now whilst it may not have the matte result that I was kind of expecting, it does still have quite a good look to it. It looks like a dank, rusty kind of wall, like the side of a ship for example, or in a sewer. So each of them will have an effect, and you'll still get that rusty effect coming through it. They all look really, really different. I'm not saying one is bad, one is good, but what is they look different, so therefore you may well be able to use that information to your advantage to get the look in different situations that you're looking for. And what I would say is definitely not one product will do everything for you. they'll all give a slightly different effect, and that's up to you to take advantage of. But also, a couple of things I have learned through this process is that if you are going to seal your dirty down paint, whether that be rust, the yellow rust, the moss, or the verdigris, it's going to have effects on the final results. So for starters, whatever you use is going to dull down that patina a little bit. So therefore, what I'd recommend, if you do want to seal it, then take that dulling down into account when you apply it, and go for a brighter, more vivid rust than you might be looking for, because that will dull down a little bit when you then put a varnish over it. You can minimise this effect either by using a low pressure through an airbrush, or by doing it at arm's length, so therefore allowing the varnish to dry slightly before it hits the model. This will take a little bit of test and adjust depending on the heat and humidity of the day that you're applying it. So test it on something inconspicuous first before you go for your main piece. So in answer, can you seal a dirty down water soluble paint? Yes you can. But which one you use and how you use it is going to be down to you and your project that you're trying to create. Now, if any of the ones we're looking at today look like exactly the sort of thing that you're looking for, then I'll put some links down in the description for you. Now, testing these today was a really interesting challenge, and I hope it helped you find the product for you and your project. Now, if you enjoyed it, you learned something new, or found it really helpful, then please hit the like button, and I'll see you for the next project.